The official name for my garage is garage. But in my head, on my home network, and to the two friends who are allowed inside, it's the lab. And on this particular sun-drenched Saturday morning, the lab was humming with the quiet energy of imminent flight. Most guys my age with this much disposable income and a desperate need for a hobby buy a sports car or a boat. Maybe they get really into artisanal sourdough or competitive woodworking. I bought a quadcopter with a thermal imaging payload and enough battery life to fly to Vegas and back. Okay, not really. But it could probably order a pizza if the FAA regulations on airborne food delivery weren't such a nightmare. This wasn't some plastic toy from a big box store. This was Hephaestus. He was my baby, my magnum opus. A sleek carbon fiber body held 4 whisper-quiet, brushless motors. Tucked underneath, nestled in a 3-axis gimbal that could stay level in a hurricane, was the magic. A camera array that blended high-resolution optical, infrared, and thermal imaging into a single, data-rich video stream. To most people, it would look like an angry, futuristic insect. To me, it was the key. After 3 years as a data scientist for the California Department of Forestry, I'd walked away. I was tired of watching our wildfire prediction models lag 5 years behind the available technology. I'd seen good people, brave people, fighting monsters with maps that were hours, sometimes days, out of date. It was like sending knights into battle against a dragon with a hand-drawn cartoon of what the dragon might look like. So, I quit. I took my severance, my savings, and a lucrative but soul-crushingly dull freelance consulting gig, and I started building my own dragon spotting system. Hephaestus was its eye in the sky. I did the final pre-flight check, the tablet in my hand showing a green light across all systems. Gyroscope, stable. GPS lock, 14 satellites. Battery, 100%. I grinned. "All right, big guy," I murmured. "Let's go see what the forest is thinking today." I carried him out to the backyard. Redwood Creek Estates was the kind of pristine, upper-middle-class subdivision that probably features heavily in brochures for anxiety medication. Perfectly manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and a palpable sense of judgment that hung in the air thicker than the morning marine layer. My property backed right up against the tall wooden fence that separated our little slice of suburban paradise from the vast and notoriously tinder-dry San Gabriel National Forest. It was the perfect location for my work. And, as I was about to discover, the perfect location for a war. With a soft whir, Hephaestus lifted off. The flight was flawless, a smooth, vertical ascent straight up to 399 feet. I'm a stickler for the rules. He hovered for a moment, a silent guardian, before banking gently to begin his pre-programmed survey route along the forest edge. On my tablet, the world transformed. The manicured lawns became cool blue and green carpets. The asphalt street was a ribbon of warm orange. The forest itself was a complex tapestry of heat signatures, a living, breathing thing that my system was learning to read. I was so engrossed in the data stream, tracing the cool signature of a hidden creek bed, that I didn't hear the approach. I felt it, a disturbance in the force. "What is that thing? Get it down, now!" The shriek was so sudden and so piercing that I physically flinched, nearly dropping the tablet. I spun around. There, on the neighboring lawn, which was so perfect it looked like it had been rendered by a computer, stood Carol Peterson. Carol was the self-appointed queen, judge, and executioner of the Redwood Creek Estates Homeowners Association. A retired insurance litigator in her 60s, she moved through the world with the unshakable certainty that she, and only she, understood the sacred texts of the CCNRs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that governed our lives. Today, she was clad in a pastel pink tracksuit and a tennis visor. and she was pointing a trembling, perfectly manicured finger at Hephaestus. "Morning, Carol," I said, forcing a calm I did not feel. "It's just my drone. It's perfectly legal." "I don't care if it's Air Force One, Mr. Henderson," she snapped, her voice somehow both shrill and booming. "It is a nuisance. It is invading my privacy. It is scaring my cat, Bartholomew." I glanced over at her porch swing. A fluffy Persian cat, presumably Bartholomew, was not just sleeping, but appeared to be in a state of tranquil hibernation, so deep he might not wake until spring. "Carol, it's 400 feet in the air," I explained, trying to channel my inner kindergarten teacher. "The camera is pointing at the forest. I promise you, it has zero interest in your prize-winning azaleas. I am the president of this homeowners association," she declared, puffing out her chest, "and I am telling you that airborne menace is in direct violation of Section 12, subsection C, creation of undue auditory or visual disturbance. Land it immediately, or you will be hearing from our legal counsel." I sighed. A long, weary sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of my soul. I knew that bylaw. It was a vague, catch-all piece of legislative fluff designed to give the HOA power over anything they didn't like the look of. Fighting it would be like wrestling with a greased pig in a courtroom. It was a fight I didn't have the time or energy for. With a few taps on the tablet, I initiated the return to home sequence. Hephaestus abandoned his survey and made a graceful descent back to my lawn. As the drone settled silently onto its landing pad, I saw Carol, a grimly triumphant smile on her face, scribbling furiously on a clipboard she'd produced from thin air. I picked up my drone and headed back to the safety of the lab. I had a feeling this was just the overture, and with Carol, the opera was always a tragedy. 2 days later, my fears were officially validated in a crisp, cream-colored envelope taped to my front door. It wasn't just a letter, it was a declaration of war. The subject line, in an aggressive, bolded Times New Roman, read, "Re, Airborne Menace." The document within was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive legalese. It detailed my flagrant disregard for community serenity and my unapproved aerial activities. It slapped me with a $100 fine and, most impressively, cited a brand-new bylaw that had seemingly sprung into existence overnight. The Unmanned Aerial Systems and Remote-Controlled Hobbyist Aircraft Prohibition Addendum. I had to read that twice. She'd written an entire piece of legislation in 48 hours just for me, I muttered to the empty hallway. You had to admire the work ethic, even if it was fueled by pure, unadulterated spite. My first instinct was to frame it. My second, more practical instinct was to toss it in the recycling bin. It had to be unenforceable. A single HOA couldn't just override federal aviation law, right? I decided to ignore it. A bold strategy, I know, but it was all I had. The following week, the conflict escalated from the skies to the ground. A dusty Ford F-150 rumbled up to my house, towing a small trailer with a brand-new backup generator. The side of the truck read Dave's Dependable Contracting. Dave himself, a burly, no-nonsense guy with a thick mustache and a sun-beaten face, hopped out, followed by 2 younger guys who looked like they were his nephews. They were here to begin Phase 2 of the lab, the infrastructure upgrade. My predictive models required a staggering amount of processing power. The server rack in my garage was already pushing the limits of my home's electrical system, and the noise from the cooling fans was starting to become noticeable. The plan was to install dedicated circuits, professional-grade soundproofing, and a climate control system. The backup generator was the crown jewel. When a real wildfire hits, the first thing to go is the power grid. My system needed to stay online, a lone beacon of data in the chaos. It wasn't a factory, it was a lifeboat. The crew hadn't even finished unloading their tools when the front door of the house next door flew open. Carol marched across her lawn, her sensible walking shoes making angry, determined prints in the dew-kissed grass. She came to a halt at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, radiating disapproval. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the morning quiet. "All commercial construction must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee." Dave, who looked like he'd dealt with his fair share of Carols, wiped his hands on a rag and faced her. "Ma'am, it's a garage upgrade. We're putting in some soundproofing, running a new line. The permits are all in order with the city." Carol's eyes narrowed, zeroing in on the generator still strapped to the trailer. "And that? Are you building a factory? This is a residential community. The noise pollution alone is a violation of—" "It's a backup generator, ma'am," Dave interrupted, his patience already wearing thin. "It's one of the quietest models on the market. Only runs when the power's out." "I'll be checking your permits with the city, rest assured," she huffed, "and I'll be monitoring the decibel levels closely." She spun on her heel and marched back to her fortress, a silent promise of future paperwork hanging in the air. Dave watched her go, then turned to me and just shook his head slowly. "Your neighbor's a real piece of work, man." "You have no idea, Dave," I said with a sigh. "You have no idea." He just grunted and went back to work, but I could feel her eyes on us from her front window for the rest of the day. The walls of my suburban prison were getting thicker. A few days later, drowning in the silent judgment from next door, I decided to attempt a diplomatic mission. It was a long shot, I knew, but I had to try. My strategy was twofold: overwhelm her with logic and disarm her with sugar. I spent an hour compiling a peace treaty folder. I printed out the FAA's official guidelines for hobbyist drone pilots, my FAA registration certificate for Hephaestus, and a copy of the city noise ordinance, which clearly showed my new generator was well within the legal limits. For the grand finale, I created a simplified, one-page schematic of my project's goal, titled Community Wildfire Safety Initiative, carefully omitting any mention of my proprietary predictive algorithms. It looked official, important, and most importantly, boring. For the second prong of my attack, I baked cookies, chocolate chip, my grandma's recipe. No one could stay angry while eating one of my grandma's cookies. It was a scientific impossibility. Armed with my folder of facts and a plate of still warm cookies covered in plastic wrap, I walked the 20 yards to Carol's front door. I felt like a UN negotiator heading into a war zone. I rang the bell. After a long moment, the door opened, but only a crack. A sliver of Carol's face appeared, her eye, magnified by her glasses, regarding me with deep suspicion. "Yes?" she said, her tone suggesting I was there to sell her a faulty vacuum cleaner. "Hi, Carol," I said, putting on my most charming, non-threatening smile. I brought you some cookies." I held up the plate. She eyed them as if they might be laced with bylaw-defying poison. "I was hoping we could talk this out, clear the air." I tried to hand her the folder. "My drone isn't a toy. It's for an environmental monitoring project. It's all about fire safety for the neighborhood. It's all in here." She didn't take the folder. She didn't even look at it. Her gaze was fixed on me, cold and hard as granite. "A project?" she scoffed, the word dripping with disdain. "Mr. Henderson, a project is what my grandson does with Legos. What you are doing is operating unlicensed, privacy-invading machinery in direct violation of HOA covenants. The fine, by the way, is now $200 for failing to remit payment." And with that, she closed the door. Not a slam, but a firm, decisive click that was somehow more insulting. I stood there for a moment, holding my folder and my plate of rejected goodwill. I left the cookies on her welcome mat, a sad, sugary offering to a god who refused to be appeased. My last resort was the monthly HOA meeting. It was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and shattered dreams. The board consisted of Carol, of course, seated at the head of a long table like a queen holding court, and two other retirees. Stan, a man whose spine seemed to have been surgically removed, and Marge, a woman who nodded at everything Carol said with the frantic energy of a bobblehead doll. I waited patiently through discussions about lawn aeration and the unacceptable color of the miller's new mailbox. Then, my agenda item came up. Review of violation notice, 1428 Juniper Lane. I stood up and presented my case calmly and logically. I passed out copies of my fact folder to Stan and Marge, who accepted them with trembling hands. I explained the purpose of my research. I explained the FAA regulations. I explained that my goal was to protect the very community she claimed to be so fiercely defending. I should have known it was a trap. When I finished, Carol didn't respond. She simply clicked a button on a remote. A projector screen I hadn't even noticed descended from the ceiling, and a PowerPoint presentation flickered to life. The title slide, in a font that looked like dripping blood, read, "The Threat in Our Skies." What followed was a masterclass in fear-mongering. She had slides with grainy, extremely zoomed-in photos of Hephaestus, making it look like a sinister military weapon. She had diagrams of property lines, with ominous red arrows showing potential crash zones. She had slides full of legal jargon, taken wildly out of context, about liability and negligence. She framed me as a reckless, arrogant tech bro who was one dead battery away from setting the entire forest on fire, or worse, plummeting into a child's birthday party. I watched, horrified and morbidly impressed, as she painted a picture of utter chaos, all stemming from my quiet Saturday morning flights. Stan and Marge were captivated, their faces pale with terror. They looked from the screen to me as if I had just confessed to being a Bond villain. When she finished her presentation, the vote was a formality. All in favor of upholding the fines and the unmanned aerial systems prohibition addendum? Carol asked, her voice dripping with false solemnity. Two hands shot up instantly. I left the meeting without another word. As I walked out into the cool night air, the absurdity of it all washed over me. I was playing chess, but Carol was playing Calvin ball, and she was making up the rules as she went. And she was winning. A week of simmering frustration passed. The server was installed, the lab was now whisper quiet and climate controlled, but my primary data collection tool was grounded. Every morning I'd check the weather reports. The air was getting drier, the offshore breezes more persistent. My system, even running on old satellite data, was starting to flash warning flags. The probability of a major fire event in our region within the next 2 weeks had ticked up to 75%. The stakes were getting higher with every passing day. I couldn't let the project stall. I had to get Hephaestus back in the air. I waited for a day with high winds. It was riskier for flying, but the data would be invaluable for modeling how a fire would spread under these exact conditions. I decided my best bet was to be as discreet as possible. I drove a quarter-mile down the road to a small clearing where the subdivision's nature trail began, hoping the extra distance would keep me off Carol's immediate radar. I sent Hephaestus up, this time flying him directly over the forest canopy, well away from any homes. The feed was incredible. The wind was whipping through the trees, and I could see on the thermal display how the gusts created hot spots of friction and dryness on the forest floor. This was exactly the data I needed. For 10 glorious minutes, I was just a scientist, collecting information, my little war with the HOA forgotten. And then, the flash of red and blue lights in my peripheral vision shattered the peace. A police cruiser had rolled silently up the curb behind me. My heart sank. Of course. She must have been watching the sky like a hawk. 2 officers got out. The first was older, with a weary, seen-it-all expression and a mustache that drooped with the weight of 1,000 stupid domestic calls. His name tag read Miller. The second was younger, fitter, with a bright, curious look on his face. Officer Schmidt. From her front window, I could just make out the silhouette of Carol, her phone held high, no doubt recording the whole scene for her Facebook group. "Sir," Officer Miller began, his voice flat and tired. "We got a call about a drone being flown in a residential area, causing a disturbance." "It's my drone, officer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I pointed to the sky. "It's registered. I'm flying it according to FAA rules. And as you can see, I'm over the forest, not homes. The only disturbance is the person who called you." Officer Schmidt leaned over my shoulder, his eyes wide as he looked at my tablet. "Whoa, is that thermal imaging? What's the payload on that thing? That's not a DJI, is it?" "It's custom built," I said, a little flicker of pride cutting through my annoyance. "It's for fire research." "Son," Miller cut in, his patience clearly at an end, "I don't care if it's curing cancer. Your neighbor says it's bothering her. This is an HOA dispute, which makes it a civil matter. Technically, we shouldn't even be here." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "But here's the thing. The dispatcher doesn't know the difference. All they know is that the same address keeps calling about the same thing. And if we have to keep coming out here, it's going to stop being a civil matter and start being my matter. Do you understand?" "Loud and clear, officer," I mumbled. "Just try to keep the peace," he said with a final, weary sigh. He turned and walked back to the car. Schmidt lingered for a second. "Fire research, huh? That's pretty cool, man, seriously." He gave me a quick nod and then jogged back to the cruiser. I brought Hephaestus home. The message was clear. Carol had found my weakness, my aversion to dealing with law enforcement. She could and would use them as her own private army. That night, the local news ran a segment that sent a chill down my spine. The anchor stood in front of a map, covered in angry red splotches. "Officials are issuing a stark warning tonight," she said gravely, "as severe drought conditions and forecasted Santa Ana winds create a perfect storm for catastrophic wildfires." The sky outside my window already had a faint, hazy quality to it, the sunset tinged with a sickly orange. The background threat was no longer in the background. It was knocking on the door, and I was being told to sit on my hands. My desperation was starting to outweigh my caution. The data was too important. I decided to change tactics. If I couldn't fly during the day, I would fly at night. Hephaestus's infrared cameras were designed for it, and the brushless motors were nearly silent. It was the perfect stealth vehicle, or so I thought. Under the cover of a moonless sky, I launched the drone from my backyard. It was beautiful. The world below was a ghost image, a landscape painted in shades of heat and cold. I could see a family of deer moving through the underbrush, their body heat making them glow like lanterns. I guided the drone along the fire line, my system greedily drinking in the data. For an hour, I was free. The next morning, another cream-colored envelope was taped to my door. This time, the fine was $500. The charge: creation of a nocturnal nuisance and unapproved illumination. Attached was a blurry, grainy photo, clearly taken with a high-zoom lens, of the blinking red and green FAA-mandated navigation lights on Hephaestus, looking like a demonic UFO hovering over the treetops. She must have been sitting in her darkened living room all night, just waiting. The war had entered a new, more insidious phase. Carol escalated from official notices to a full-blown smear campaign. She created a private Facebook group called Redwood Creek Neighborhood Watch, official. The first post was a photo of Dave's contracting truck from the week before. The caption read, "A concerned resident reports strange unapproved commercial construction and late-night activity at the Henderson property, 1428 Juniper. What is he building in there? What are those strange lights in the sky at night? Remember, the safety of our community is our #1 priority. Stay vigilant, neighbors." The comment section was a cesspool of paranoia. Marge W. "I heard strange humming noises. Is it a meth lab?" Asterisk. Stan P. "I agree with Carol. We need to be vigilant." Asterisk. Unknown. Neighbor. "That guy gives me weird vibes." Asterisk. People started driving slowly past my house, their gazes lingering a little too long. I felt like a zoo animal. My own home, my sanctuary, was starting to feel like enemy territory. The isolation was the worst part. I was the crazy tech bro, the neighborhood menace. Then, one afternoon, I got a glimmer of hope from the most unexpected source. I was out front, pulling a few defiant weeds from my flower bed, when the garage door next door rumbled open. Carol's husband, Bob, shuffled out, dragging a recycling bin to the curb. Bob was a quiet, defeated-looking man, who always seemed to be trying to shrink into the background. In all the time I'd lived there, I don't think we'd ever exchanged more than a cursory nod. As he walked back towards his house, he caught my eye. He glanced furtively back at his front door, then looked at me. He gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of solidarity. He leaned in as he passed my driveway. "Hey," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. "My son's into those things. The drones. Pretty cool." I was so surprised I almost dropped my trowel. "Oh, yeah, thanks, Bob." "She's—" he began, then trailed off, searching for the right word. "She's been on a tear lately. Don't take it personally." And that was it. He disappeared back into his garage before the door even fully closed. It was a small moment, maybe 10 seconds total, but it felt like a lifeline. It was the first time I realized I wasn't completely alone in this manicured, pastel-colored battlefield. Somebody else saw it too. The small victory of Bob's whispered support was short-lived. A few days later, the mailman delivered the killing blow. It wasn't another cream envelope from the HOA. This was bigger, heavier. It was a large, flat mailer from a law firm in downtown LA, with a name like Lockhart, Steel and Brimstone. It required a signature. My hands were trembling slightly as I opened it. Inside, on thick, expensive-feeling paper, was a formal cease and desist order. The language was brutal and precise. It threatened a massive multi-count lawsuit for damages related to the consistent and malicious loss of quiet enjoyment of property, flagrant invasion of privacy through aerial surveillance, and the creation of a hazardous environment through reckless endangerment. It didn't just mention the drone. It referenced the unauthorized commercial-grade structure being built in my garage. It demanded that I permanently ground all unmanned aerial systems and dismantle the unauthorized server farm and power generation facility. This was it, the breaking point. I could laugh off HOA fines, I could ignore a Facebook group, but I couldn't afford a lawsuit from a firm that probably billed by the second. Even a frivolous lawsuit would drown me in legal fees. Carol, the retired insurance litigator, had finally brought out the heavy artillery. My project, my passion, the entire reason I'd upended my life, was effectively dead in the water. I slumped into a chair in my living room, the letter feeling like a tombstone in my hands. Hephaestus was grounded for good. That night, the world outside decided to mock my defeat. The TV weather forecaster had a strained, serious look on his face. He stood in front of a satellite map that glowed an angry, pulsating red. "We are now under a red flag warning for the entire region," he announced, his voice grim. A powerful Santa Ana wind event is developing, with gusts expected to reach 60 miles per hour. Combined with single-digit humidity, this creates the most dangerous fire conditions we've seen this year. All residents in or near canyon and forest areas are urged to be on high alert. The camera panned to a more detailed map, and my stomach twisted into a knot. The blood-red warning area completely covered the San Gabriel National Forest, its eastern edge bleeding right over the neat, tidy grid of Redwood Creek estates. I looked from the ominous glow of the TV screen to the cease and desist letter on my coffee table. Then through the window into the dark garage where Hephaestus sat, silent and powerless. I was trapped. The monster was coming, and the one thing that could help us see it in the dark was locked in its cage, all because of the monster next door. The next day dawned with a strange, oppressive energy. The sky wasn't blue, it was a pale, dusty yellow. The wind had arrived as promised, a hot, angry gust that rattled the windows and tore at the trees, making them groan and sway like they were in pain. And then came the smell. Faint at first, just a tickle in the back of my throat, but it grew steadily stronger with every gust of wind, the dry, acrid scent of burning chaparral. My phone buzzed with the first official alert from the county. A brush fire had started in the foothills, about 10 miles west of us. The text message ended with the infuriatingly calm assurance, "No immediate threat to residential areas at this time." It was a lie. Not a malicious lie, but a necessary one told by fire departments everywhere to prevent mass panic and clogged evacuation routes. But my system, even hamstrung and fed only on public satellite and weather data, knew the truth. It was screaming it at me from my monitor in the lab. The wind direction, the fuel density, the topography. It was all a perfect recipe for disaster. The wind would push the fire east, directly our way. I spent the next hour pacing my garage like a caged animal. On one screen, I had a live feed from a weather satellite, showing a plume of smoke on the horizon that was no longer a plume, but a dirty, spreading stain. On another, my wind speed models updated in real time, the numbers glowing a terrifying red. The fire was moving faster, much faster, than the official reports were admitting. The cease and desist letter sat on my workbench, a paper shackle. Every rational part of my brain, the part that paid mortgages and feared lawyers, screamed at me to leave it alone. To pack a bag, grab my hard drives, and get out like every other sane person, but I couldn't. I thought of the firefighters who would be sent into those canyons with incomplete information. I thought of my neighbors, the ones who sneered at me and the ones who were probably terrified. I thought of Bob's small conspiratorial nod. My moral compass, which had been spinning wildly for weeks, finally clicked into place. It pointed towards the sky. "Screw the lawsuit," I said out loud to the empty garage. The decision was made. I grabbed Hephaestus and my tablet and ran out to the backyard. The wind was a physical force now, trying to tear the drone from my hands. It was a much more dangerous flight than any I had ever attempted. One strong, unpredictable gust could send the drone tumbling out of the sky. This wasn't a test anymore. This was a mission. I found a small patch of grass that was slightly sheltered by the house and braced myself. I pushed the throttle. Hephaestus fought against the wind, its motors whining in protest as it clawed its way into the turbulent air. It wobbled violently, and for one heart-stopping second, I thought it was going to go down. But the gyros compensated, the flight controller fought back, and the drone stabilized, a defiant black cross against the sickly yellow sky. The moment the camera feed came online, my blood ran cold. The tablet screen showed a terrifying reality that the distant view couldn't capture. The fire wasn't a single plume of smoke anymore. It was a front, a miles-wide wall of churning smoke and orange fury, devouring everything in its path. But that wasn't the worst part. My predictive model, now fed with real-time thermal data, immediately flagged something new. Something the satellites couldn't see through the thick smoke canopy. A smaller, secondary fire had just sparked from a flying ember, much, much closer to us. It was in the bottom of Redwood Canyon, a place notorious for its unpredictable wind patterns and difficult access. This new fire, invisible to the official response teams, was on a direct, unimpeded path to the east side of Redwood Creek Estates. I was so focused on the screen, trying to calculate the new fire's speed, that I didn't register her arrival until she was right on top of me. "I knew it!" Carol Peterson stormed into my backyard from the side gate she'd apparently thrown open, her face a mask of triumphant, righteous fury. The wind whipped her hair around her face, making her look like a vengeful spirit. She was holding her phone up, the red dot of its recording light glowing malevolently. "I have you now, Henderson. In direct violation of a legal cease and desist, you are going to jail." "Carol, shut up," I snapped, my voice raw with adrenaline. I didn't even look at her, my eyes glued to the horrifying data streaming onto my tablet. "Go home. Get your photos, get your pets, get your important documents. We need to evacuate. Now." "Don't you dare try to change the subject," she shrieked over the howl of the wind. "I am documenting this for the police, who I have already called. They're on their way. You are finished." As if on cue, I heard the siren. It grew closer, then cut off abruptly out front. A moment later, the two cops from before, Miller and Schmidt, burst through my side gate, drawn by the shouting. "What in God's name is going on here?" Miller yelled. I didn't have time to explain. I needed them to see. I sprinted into the garage, grabbed the HDMI cable, and plugged my tablet into the 70-inch monitor on the wall. The massive screen, which I usually used for data analysis, flickered to life. And suddenly, everyone saw what I saw. The image filled the garage, a swirling, terrifying thermal view of the hidden fire front. It wasn't an abstract map anymore. It was a living, breathing monster of heat and destruction, a river of white-hot fury roaring through the canyon directly towards us. An overlay of my neighborhood map showed the property lines with chilling clarity. Everyone froze. Carol's tirade died in her throat, her mouth hanging open. Miller and Schmidt stared, slack-jawed, at the unbelievable image. "My God," Schmidt whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror. "What is that?" "That's a spot fire," I said, my voice tight. "In Redwood Canyon. The main fire is miles away. It's a diversion. This one will be here in 20 minutes. Maybe less." Miller stared at the screen for another second, his weary cynicism evaporating in the face of the raw data. He snatched the radio from his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is 7 Adam 12. I have an emergency," he yelled into the mic, his voice sharp and clear. "I have eyes on a new fire front. I repeat, a new fire front, approaching Redwood Creek Estates from the east, up Redwood Canyon. It's moving fast. You need to reroute air support now. This is not a drill." Carol stood motionless, her phone hanging limply at her side. Her face was ashen. She was looking at the screen, at the thermal signature of the firestorm, and then at the property line overlay. The angry red arrow of my predictive model, indicating the most likely path of destruction, was pointing directly at her house. The next few hours were a symphony of controlled chaos. Within minutes of Miller's call, the sky filled with a new sound, the deep, throaty roar of air tankers. A massive DC-10, redirected from the main fire, swooped low over the ridge, releasing a massive, vibrant red curtain of fire retardant that blanketed the canyon slope just a few hundred yards from our back fences. 2 smaller planes followed, reinforcing the line. They were guided not by sight, but by the coordinates I was feeding to Officer Miller, who was relaying them to the fire captain over the radio. My garage, the lab, had become an impromptu forward command center. The neighborhood was a blur of activity. Emergency vehicles filled the streets. Reverse 911 calls went out. We were under a mandatory evacuation order, but the firefighters, now armed with accurate information, were able to make a stand. They held the line. By nightfall, the immediate danger had passed. The spot fire had been contained, choked off by the retardant line. Our neighborhood was still standing, untouched by the flames, an island of safety surrounded by a sea of blackened earth. The fire captain, a tall man with a soot-stained face and exhausted eyes, eventually found his way to my garage. He looked at my screens, at the drone now safely back on its landing pad, and then at me. He reached out and shook my hand, his grip firm. "Your early warning saved these homes, son," he said, his voice rough with smoke and fatigue. "We were blind in that canyon. The smoke was too thick. I don't know what that thing is you're flying, but you saved us hours. You saved lives today." In the chaos, Carol had vanished. Her car was gone. Her house was dark. The neighborhood which had been treating me with suspicion for weeks now looked at me differently. As I stood in my driveway, people who were filtering back to their homes after the evacuation was lifted stopped to thank me. Dave, the contractor, drove by in his truck, rolled down his window, and gave me a wide grin. "Told you she was a piece of work," he yelled over the engine. "Glad you didn't listen." He gave me a thumbs up and rumbled down the street. The next day the air was still thick with the smell of smoke, but the wind had died down. I was in my driveway, using a hose to wash a thin layer of fine gray ash off the concrete, when I saw movement next door. It was Bob. He shuffled over from his yard, his shoulders slumped, but his face holding an expression I'd never seen before. He was holding 2 sweating bottles of beer. "She's inside," he said quietly, not quite meeting my eye. "Packing, going to visit her sister, in Florida." He paused. "For a while?" "I'm sorry, Bob," I said because it felt like the right thing to say. He finally looked up at me, and a small, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. "No," he said, "you're not." He held out one of the beers to me. "And neither am I." I took the bottle. We stood there for a long moment in silence, drinking our beers, 2 survivors of a different kind of firestorm. A week later, life had begun to return to a strange new normal. The HOA, now under the temporary leadership of a very flustered Stan, had sent me a formal letter. It wasn't cream-colored. It was on plain white paper. It formally rescinded all fines, issued a public apology in the community newsletter, and asked if I would consider becoming their official wildfire safety consultant. I was in my backyard, Hephaestus sitting on its landing pad, clean and ready. I looked out over the fence at the hills. They were black and scarred, a stark reminder of how close we had come. But we were safe. In the end, Carol was right about one thing. My drone was an airborne menace, just not to her petunias. I smiled, picked up my tablet, and sent Hephaestus soaring up into the clear, quiet, blue sky.